Welcome back. I'm Tucker. I believe the most dangerous grudges aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who stay quiet until the perfect chance for revenge comes along. From trusting his cousin completely until that same cousin led him straight into a trap, to a jealous best friend who shoved her off a mountain, convinced she'd get away with it. It was October 17th, 2015. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across a family-operated grain farm outside Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, Canada. Derek Lavoie, a 29-year-old farmhand, approached the 40-foot steel grain silo with a wrench and his work gloves. Derek had worked on his uncle's farm since graduating high school, choosing agricultural labor over college. He was reliable and known for staying late to handle equipment repairs that others avoided. Unmarried and living in a small rental house near the property, he spent most evenings maintaining machinery or helping his cousin Gareth with field work. His hands were calloused from years of manual labor, and his friends said he took pride in being the go-to person for difficult mechanical problems around the farm. Grain silos store thousands of bushels of wheat or barley, with augers moving grain from bottom to top. Clogs create voids and unstable bridges that can collapse suddenly, and moving grain can engulf a person in seconds. Most farms require lockouts and spotters, but smaller operations often skip these precautions during busy seasons. That afternoon, Derek needed to clear a jammed auger inside the main silo. The blockage had stopped operations for 2 days, delaying shipments to a regional grain distributor. Derek's uncle was traveling, leaving him and Gareth to handle the problem. What Derek didn't know was that Gareth, his 36-year-old cousin, had recently discovered Derek had been sleeping with his wife. The betrayal had been eating at Gareth for weeks, transforming years of camaraderie into bitter resentment. Derek climbed the external ladder and entered through the top hatch, without a safety harness or fall arrest, descending into the grain-filled chamber. Gareth remained outside, supposedly monitoring the auger controls. Standard procedure required the auger's power to be completely disconnected during internal work, with multiple safety locks engaged. Gareth had told Derek everything was secure, but he had deliberately bypassed the emergency disengage mechanism, leaving the system vulnerable to accidental or intentional activation. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, Derek reached the blockage point 15 feet below the grain surface. He radioed Gareth that he'd located the jam and was working to clear it. The radio's reply came through as static. Inside the steel shell, reception was poor. Moments later, without warning or explanation, the auger roared to life. The mechanical screw began churning violently, creating immediate and catastrophic grain movement. Derek shouted into his radio as thousands of pounds of wheat shifted around him, the grain flowing like liquid toward the auger's intake. The suction pulled him sideways into the steel wall with crushing force. His torso compressed against the silo's interior as grain continued flowing, pinning him completely. A farmhand working near the equipment shed heard Derek's muffled screams and ran to the silo base. He peered through the 6-inch inspection port and could see grain packed tightly against the silo wall, with no movement where Derek had been working moments earlier. The witness immediately shut down the main power and called emergency services, but the grain's pressure made extraction impossible without specialized equipment. Rescue teams spent 3 hours carefully removing grain to access Derek's body. He had suffocated within minutes of entrapment, unable to expand his chest against the compressed wheat. The autopsy revealed the official cause of death as compression asphyxia with associated crush injuries caused by grain entrapment. Provincial investigators sealed the silo and found the safety switches had been deliberately tampered that morning. Forensic testing confirmed the modifications were recent, and surveillance showed Gareth repeatedly near the control panel before the accident. He was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and criminal negligence causing death. He was later convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment under Canadian law, with parole eligibility set decades into the future. It was the early morning of the 18th of September 2019 in Atlanta, Georgia. Police lights reflected across rain-soaked streets, while emergency crews surrounded the wreckage of a small sedan crushed against a concrete divider near downtown after a violent collision. Mason Ryder was 24 and the son of a wealthy property developer. He had spent the evening drinking at several bars before getting behind the wheel of his SUV. Surveillance footage confirmed Ryder was heavily intoxicated when he ran a red light and struck a vehicle driven by 18-year-old Skylar Bennett, a college freshman returning home from a volunteer event. The impact crushed the driver's side of her car and pushed it into a concrete divider. Skylar died at the scene before emergency responders could remove her from the wreckage. The loss completely destroyed Skylar's family. She had been the only child her parents were able to have after years of failed fertility treatments and multiple miscarriages. Friends described her as the center of their lives, especially for her mother, who had struggled emotionally for years before finally becoming a parent. Less than a year later, Skylar's mother was found dead at home following a severe mental health decline after Skylar's death, leaving Skylar's father, Adrian Bennett, a 47-year-old logistics manager, completely alone with unbearable grief. Although Mason Ryder was arrested for drunk driving, but he later avoided prison through a plea agreement negotiated by well-connected defense attorneys hired by his wealthy family. He received probation and temporary driving restrictions instead of a lengthy prison sentence. Adrian Bennett struggled deeply after the case concluded. He became emotionally unstable and consumed by anger after feeling justice had failed both his daughter and wife. He lost his family and justice didn't give him jail time. This is what we get when the system is broken, and I understand what it means to be helpless. It's not a funny place to be. Over the following 2 years, Adrian isolated himself from relatives and co-workers while becoming increasingly fixated on Mason Ryder and his daily routines. Adrian regularly followed Ryder around the city, including at restaurants, gyms, and clubs. Ryder eventually became aware Adrian was following him, and several hostile confrontations between the two men were later reported by witnesses and documented in police records. Phone records showed growing hostility and threatening language. On the night of July 11, 2021, Ryder attended a nightclub in downtown Atlanta before leaving shortly after 2 a.m. driving a large black pickup truck. Security footage showed Adrian Bennett leaving the same area in his sedan several minutes earlier. While traveling along Interstate 75 near downtown Atlanta, approaching an elevated overpass section, Ryder recognized Adrian's sedan driving ahead and accelerated behind him. Mason knew Adrian was out there watching him. He knew. And on that stretch of interstate, that tells me something about Mason Ryder that the trial probably didn't spend enough time on. Ryder uses his truck to strike the smaller vehicle repeatedly from behind at high speed. The truck's front end slammed into Adrian's rear bumper with violent force. The sedan shook and skidded forward. Ryder accelerated again and struck harder. Adrian lost control and the sedan spun across 2 lanes. Ryder's truck struck a third time, driving the sedan toward the guardrail. Adrian tried to correct, but the vehicle crashed through the weakened guardrail section and plunged into the rocky, shallow water below. The sedan hit rocks and water with tremendous impact. Adrian's body struck the steering wheel and windshield. Water rushed into the submerged vehicle. Emergency crews later recovered Adrian Bennett from the wreckage, but he died from severe traumatic injuries before reaching the hospital. After investigation, Mason Ryder was questioned, and he claimed the collision had been accidental. However, investigators reviewing vehicle data and surveillance footage discovered the truck deliberately accelerated several times immediately before impact, contradicting his account. Ryder was arrested and charged with the death of Adrian and multiple related offenses. Prosecutors argued he intentionally used his truck as a weapon after years of resentment and fear. He was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. It was the 31st of October 2017. The streets of a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, were full of costumes and laughter of people celebrating Halloween festival. Somewhere in an isolated street, a Halloween prank intended to scare a classmate would end in fatality. Maxwell Parker, a 17-year-old student who was known for humiliating younger classmates. Over the previous year, Ethan had gained a reputation for stealing costumes during school events, posting embarrassing videos online, and disrupting neighborhood Halloween activities. activities. Several local teenagers had grown increasingly resentful. Rather than confronting him directly, 4 of them planned what they called a Halloween scare. They chose an abandoned Victorian-style house that had sat vacant for years. The deteriorating building was a popular gathering spot for teenagers, despite repeated warnings from authorities. Many first-floor windows had been boarded up following years of vandalism, leaving the front entrance as the main practical route in and out. On Halloween night, the group convinced Maxwell to visit the house by claiming expensive electronic equipment had been hidden there as part of a challenge. Their plan was to lock him inside temporarily, play pre-recorded sounds through hidden Bluetooth speakers, and release him after about 20 minutes. Shortly after 9 p.m., Maxwell entered the house carrying a flashlight. Once inside, the teenagers secured the front door from outside using a wooden board. Hidden speakers began playing distorted voices, footsteps, and other unsettling sounds throughout the building. Believing the hidden equipment might be upstairs, Maxwell moved deeper into the structure and searched several rooms. At first, he assumed he was the target of a prank and shouted insults toward his friends. However, his frustration soon turned into panic when repeated attempts to leave failed. Unknown to the group, the abandoned house was occasionally used by transients seeking shelter. Earlier that evening, one occupant had been using candles and a small portable stove in an upstairs room. At approximately 9:10 p.m., a candle tipped onto nearby debris. The resulting fire spread from papers and fabric to old curtains and dry wooden flooring. After unsuccessfully trying to extinguish it, the occupant fled. Outside, the teenagers initially overlooked faint smoke coming from an upstairs window. By the time they realized a real fire had started, smoke had already spread through parts of the second floor and stairwell. Panicking, they removed the barricade and shouted for Maxwell to come outside. Witnesses later reported hearing him yelling from inside as smoke filled portions of the building. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but heavy smoke and the building's deteriorated condition complicated rescue efforts. After the fire was put out, Maxwell Parker was found inside the building and was later confirmed dead. Doctors said he had light burns, but the main cause of death was smoke inhalation and carbon monoxide poisoning, which means he breathed in too much toxic smoke and could not get enough oxygen. The fire was caused by an accident involving a candle left burning by another person in the building. However, investigators said Maxwell could not escape quickly because the front door had been blocked. This delay made the situation worse when the smoke spread. The 4 teenagers were charged with unlawful confinement and reckless endangerment. They did not plan for anyone to die, but their actions helped create a dangerous situation. The fire had nothing to do with them. A candle in an upstairs room, a stranger they never knew was there. What they contributed was the locked door, and in a burning building, a locked door is everything. It was June 14, 2016. A rural equipment yard in West Texas sat quietly under the early morning sky. The sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across rows of stacked materials and idle machinery. The air was still and dry, typical for the season. No wind stirred the dust between the storage bays. The yard was empty except for one person on duty. Xander Holtz was 34 years old and worked as an independent hauler. He had a reputation for moving fast and cutting corners when he thought no one was watching. Over the years, he had skipped full load inspections more times than he could count, always prioritizing speed over procedure. It saved him time, and time meant more runs. He was known among other drivers as someone who took risks but always seemed to get away with it. His truck was older but well-maintained, and he prided himself on completing routes faster than anyone else. That morning, he arrived before dawn to pick up a load of bundled steel pipes that had been stacked the night before. He was alone with the yard coordinator, Lena Markham, age 29, who managed dispatch and load releases. Their relationship had soured weeks earlier after Xander publicly blamed her for a delayed payout that cost him a contract. She had sent him a message days before that read, "Check your load next time." He never responded. The pipes were stacked unevenly on the flatbed trailer. Only 2 straps secured the load instead of the required 4. The upper tier sat off-center, visibly imbalanced, and had been intentionally stacked without chocks, making it dependent entirely on strap tension. Markham approved the release anyway. Xander walked around the trailer once, then climbed onto the bed to adjust a loose strap near the top. Security footage from the yard gate captured him standing on the trailer deck, leaning over the bundles. Markham stood nearby, watching but not moving. The camera angle showed her arms crossed, her posture still. As Xander loosened the first strap, The tension holding the upper tier gave way. 3 steel pipes rolled off the stack in quick succession. The first struck him across the torso, pinning him against the trailer bed. The second followed immediately, crushing his chest. The third hit his shoulder and knocked him sideways. His head struck the edge rail as he fell. The weight of the pipes compressed his ribcage, causing massive internal trauma. He showed no further movement. Markham remained stationary for approximately 90 seconds before contacting emergency services. Emergency services arrived 23 minutes later. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene. The cause was blunt force trauma and crush injuries to the chest and head. Investigators reviewed security footage and found the load had been improperly secured from the start. Missing chocks, uneven stacking, and insufficient straps were documented, along with text messages between Xander Holtz and Lena Markham, including her prior warning. Phone and dispatch records confirmed Markham had been at the yard over an hour before Holtz arrived and had overseen the pipe stacking the previous evening. Witnesses from the previous shift verified her presence during loading operations. Authorities determined she knowingly approved an unsafe load following a personal conflict. She was charged and later convicted of manslaughter, receiving a 9-year sentence with parole eligibility. The equipment yard was fined for safety violations, permanently revised its procedures, and the case closed 4 months later. It was May 14, 2016. Humid air hung over a Midwest subdivision as crews prepared work around an 8-foot excavation. Reed Foster, 41, had 15 years in residential construction. As site supervisor, he was methodical and safety-focused. 3 weeks earlier, he had fired concrete foreman Mark Delano after a heated confrontation over overtime pay demands. During the termination meeting, Delano made threatening statements about making Reed pay for the firing. Security cameras captured the exchange, and witnesses later testified to the threats. Following his termination, Mark Delano sent increasingly hostile text messages to Reed's phone. The messages escalated from complaints about destroyed livelihood to surveillance threats and references to construction site accidents. Reed had reported the threats to his supervisor but hadn't involved the police. The morning's concrete pour was scheduled for 6:30 a.m., requiring 80 cubic yards. A security camera recorded the work zone continuously. At 6:42 a.m., footage clearly showed Mark Delano removing 2 diagonal bracing boards from the eastern wall, supports critical to stabilizing that section of the excavation under load. Despite being terminated, Delano had retained his hard hat and safety vest. With the early morning start and minimal supervision on site, he was able to blend in with the crew without being immediately challenged. He systematically removed the critical support beams before leaving. Reed descended alone to inspect rebar placement, a routine check before major pours. Above, the concrete truck's chute extended over the excavation. Reed carried his standard inspection clipboard. Unaware that the excavation's structural integrity had been compromised, Reed continued his inspection moments before the concrete pour was scheduled to begin. Loose soil and debris from the collapsing wall surged around his boots, pinning his legs against the rebar. The eastern wall collapsed without warning. Unsupported soil cascaded inward, striking Reed's legs and pelvis with tremendous force. The impact pinned his lower body against rebar as tons of compacted earth continued pouring in, trapping him completely. In the seconds following the collapse, the concrete pour continued momentarily before workers recognized the failure. With slurry already flowing into the compromised excavation, concrete was poured into the collapsed trench, compounding the soil burial and increasing the crushing pressure against Reed's lower body. The mixture's density created crushing pressure as he struggled unsuccessfully to free himself. Reed's movements became increasingly restricted as compacted soil and concrete slurry compressed his torso. Combined soil and concrete weight crushed his ribcage, making breathing increasingly difficult. His struggles only drove him deeper as the mixture continued rising around his shoulders. The weight became unbearable as the mixture rose high against his upper torso. Security footage showed Reed becoming motionless as rising concrete and compacted soil compressed his chest and airway. The pour continued for several seconds before workers noticed something was wrong and shouted for the truck to stop. Crew members rushed toward the excavation. Emergency crews arrived within 12 minutes, but the concrete had already begun stiffening, complicating rescue efforts. Recovery required jackhammers and cutting equipment. Reed was extracted after 47 minutes, but resuscitation efforts failed. The coroner determined death by compressive asphyxia with blunt force trauma. Security footage confirmed deliberate bracing removal caused the structural failure. Cell phone records placed Mark Delano at the construction site during the sabotage window, contradicting his alibi. After a 6-month investigation, Mark Delano was arrested and charged under a premeditated homicide statute. During the trial, prosecutors presented the threatening text messages, security footage, and witness testimony. Delano was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court cited overwhelming evidence of premeditation and intent, concluding that the killing resulted from a deliberate act carried out after a workplace grievance. It was September 5, 2018, on a busy beach in Mumbai, India. As the afternoon heat lingered, responders later warned that shallow holes where vendors had dumped hot coals still concealed buried embers beneath the sand. Families passed food stalls and grills, with nothing to suggest what would unfold minutes later. Ananya Rao was 19, a first-year education student commuting from Andheri. She tutored children and helped at her mother's tailoring shop. Quiet and conflict-averse, she came to the beach between classes and work, leaving her phone face down on her towel to rest. Her circle was small. That afternoon, a friend brought Rohit Malakar, 25, who had been messaging her for weeks. 2 days earlier, Ananya had blocked him after filing a brief harassment complaint with her college, which led to him being barred from a campus tutoring program. Near a snack cart, he approached her again and asked her out. She declined in front of others. Several people nearby recognized him from the earlier dispute. He walked away without responding. As evening approached, most of the group left to find food. Ananya stayed behind, lying face down to block the glare. A short distance away, shallow holes where vendors had dumped hot coals dotted the beach, left behind after portable braziers were moved earlier in the afternoon. Beneath the sand, charcoal embers remained active, insulated by packed grains. Beach maintenance had not yet cleared the area, a common problem in sections without constant supervision, where unauthorized cooking was rarely enforced. Footage from a nearby beachfront cafe later showed Rohit returning alone to one of the shallow holes. He avoided direct contact with the sand. Instead, he used a flat metal food tray discarded near the grills to scrape and lift sand directly from above the embers. A faint shimmer of heat was visible in the footage above the hole. He tipped the tray twice, testing distance rather than touch, then carried it away, holding it extended from his body. The same camera showed him walking back toward Ananya, who remained motionless on her towel. He dropped the heated sand directly onto her head and shoved her face down with both hands before recoiling almost immediately from the heat. Ananya convulsed, arms scraping the ground as sand flooded her mouth and nose. Her cries were muffled, choked by grit. The sand caused immediate blistering to exposed skin, and inhalation drew superheated particles into her airway. Later medical findings showed that inhaled superheated sand had burned and obstructed her airway within seconds, causing rapid respiratory failure. Rohit was seen leaving several seconds later without the tray. When Ananya was later found, she was unresponsive. Her face was buried in sand that remained hot enough to burn rescuers when they tried to clear it from her mouth and nose. The skin around her mouth and cheeks was blistered and peeling. Sand was compacted into her nostrils and lips. There were no signs of a struggle beyond scrape marks in the sand beside her arms. A passerby noticed her lack of movement and ran for help. A vendor called the regional emergency number at approximately 5:02 p.m. Municipal lifeguards arrived within 3 minutes, followed by an ambulance from City Medical Services approximately 6 minutes later. Attempts to clear her airway and resuscitate her were unsuccessful. The autopsy confirmed death from mechanical suffocation and severe airway burns caused by inhaling superheated sand, which rapidly closed the throat and led to quick oxygen loss. Partial bystander videos and footage from the beachfront cafe captured the assault and the minutes-long delay before help arrived, later becoming central evidence in the investigation. Rohit was identified and detained that night. After a 4-year trial, he was convicted of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. In the months that followed, Local authorities ordered a ban on dumping hot coals on the beach and increased enforcement against unauthorized cooking. It was June 18, 2013. The municipal police headquarters in La Paz, Bolivia, sat under cloudless skies, its basement evidence rooms holding more than just confiscated property. Inside one of these windowless concrete spaces, used as an off-the-books overflow locker, a 26-year-old citizen rights activist named Carlos Rojas was about to begin a slow death that would expose systemic abuse within the city's detention system. Carlos had spent 3 years working with a grassroots transparency organization, documenting cases of police corruption and extortion in La Paz's working-class neighborhoods. He wasn't a lawyer or journalist, just a community organizer with a notebook and stubborn conviction. His recent report had detailed specific instances of officers demanding bribes from street vendors and unlawfully detaining citizens for fabricated offenses. Carlos had mastered this methodical approach, building cases that had previously led to 2 officer suspensions. On June 18th, Officer Eduardo Morales, a 41-year-old police sergeant named in Carlos's latest report, arrested him on fabricated drug possession charges. Morales had a documented history of detainee abuse, including 3 prior complaints that had been administratively dismissed. Instead of processing Carlos through normal booking procedures where his detention would be logged and monitored, Morales took him directly to the basement overflow room. The space was approximately 8 by 10 feet, concrete walls, no windows, with a single overhead bulb and a locked steel door. Morales had repeatedly tampered with the evidence ledger and the quartermaster's key logs. Morales told other officers Carlos was being held pending investigation, but never entered him into the official detention log. No food or water was provided. The room had no toilet or sink. June temperatures in La Paz reached 65 degrees Fahrenheit during day, but the basement remained cold at night. Carlos's family reported him missing within 24 hours, but police claimed they had no record of his whereabouts. Within 48 hours of his detention, Carlos began showing marked dehydration symptoms, including intense thirst, dizziness, headache, decreased urine output, and confusion. His lips cracked, and his eyes had sunken deeply. Medical examiners later noted that the human body typically survives 3 to 5 days without water, depending on conditions, physical health, and ambient temperature. They concluded the cold basement environment accelerated Carlos's decline toward the lower end of that window. By the 3rd day of his detention, Carlos could no longer stand. His kidneys were failing, his blood pressure dropping dangerously low. Officers saw him lay on the concrete floor, semi-conscious, with his skin dry and parchment-like, mucous membranes shriveled, and saliva crusted at the corners of his mouth. They said that he tried licking the floor and using his shirt to collect moisture. On June 22nd, 4 days after his detention began, a junior officer discovered him during a scheduled routine evidence audit. Carlos was unresponsive, his body positioned near the door where he had apparently tried to call for help. The officer immediately radioed for emergency medical assistance. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes and pronounced death at the scene after assessment. The autopsy listed acute dehydration and hypovolemic shock as the cause of death, noting hemoconcentration, high serum sodium, and acute kidney damage. Investigators later discovered the basement corridor camera had a 2-day gap logged as maintenance, and the evidence ledger contained several post-dated entries. Morales had exclusive access to the overflow locker that witnesses later described seeing him use alone. Officer Morales was arrested and charged with involuntary manslaughter and human rights violations. He was later convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, with the court citing deliberate unlawful detention, deprivation of basic care, and retaliatory motive. Several senior officers were suspended and later dismissed following the investigation. It was the evening of 7th February 2016. Inside a deteriorating apartment complex in Newark, New Jersey, rainwater leaked through cracked ceilings while weak hallway lights flickered above damaged concrete staircases. Residents had spent months complaining about loose stair rails and unsafe conditions on the upper floors, where rusted metal supports had begun separating from the walls. Harold Vance was 61 and owned the property. He was widely disliked for ignoring maintenance complaints while increasing rent prices. Residents repeatedly warned that several stair rails had become dangerously unstable after years of water damage and corrosion. Elderly tenants complained the railings shook whenever pressure was placed on them. Building records showed Vance delayed repairs multiple times, claiming replacement would be too expensive. Former tenants described him as arrogant and dismissive whenever residents threatened lawsuits or contacted housing inspectors. Eleanor Brooks was 74 and had lived in the building for over a decade. After her daughter and son-in-law died in a highway accident years earlier, Eleanor became sole guardian of her 15-year-old grandson, Tyler Brooks. Neighbors described Eleanor as hardworking and protective, often taking small cleaning jobs around the neighborhood despite her age to support Tyler and keep him in school. Tyler was extremely close to his grandmother because she had raised him after his parents' deaths. On the evening of 7th February, Eleanor returned home carrying groceries during heavy rain after the building elevator stopped working again. She slowly climbed the staircase toward the 4th floor while balancing several shopping bags in her arms. As she reached a landing near the upper level, the rusted stair rail suddenly snapped away from the wall when she attempted to steady herself. Eleanor lost balance and fell down the concrete stairwell, striking each step hard before hitting the lower landing. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but Eleanor died from catastrophic head and spinal injuries before reaching the hospital. The incident devastated residents throughout the building, especially Tyler, who heard the fall and rushed into the hallway moments afterward. Days later, several tenants confronted Harold Vance outside the property demanding repairs and accountability. Vance mocked residents and dismissed threats of legal action, telling them old buildings were full of risks and accidents were unavoidable. He stood outside the building where his tenant just died from a railing he refused to fix and told people accidents were unavoidable. I genuinely cannot explain that level of detachment from what you've done. In the heat of the moment, Tyler Brooks suddenly pushed through the crowd and shoved Vance near the damaged staircase railing that still had not been fully repaired. Vance lost his footing and tumbled backward down the concrete stairs. His body struck the edge of each step as he fell, rolling and twisting. He struck the lower landing hard on his back and head before stopping. Several residents screamed and rushed downstairs while others called emergency services. Harold Vance died at the hospital from severe head injuries caused by the fall. Investigators reviewed witness statements and security footage before concluding Tyler had intentionally pushed Vance because of Tyler's age and the emotional trauma surrounding his grandmother's death. Prosecutors charged him in juvenile court, while defense attorneys argued years of grief and neglect contributed to the incident. The apartment complex was later condemned after inspectors uncovered dozens of major safety violations ignored for years. It was the 18th of August, 2017, privately operated combat sports gym in Birmingham, where evening training had stretched late and recovery areas remained intermittently supervised. Darren Cole, 27, an amateur heavyweight fighter, had a documented reputation among members for aggressive sparring etiquette and repeated low-level misconduct, including mocking inexperienced trainees and hiding personal equipment. Complaints had been raised informally over time, but were largely dismissed by coaching staff as toughening behavior within a competitive environment. Tensions had escalated earlier that summer after Darren humiliated a teenage trainee during a crowded session, filming the incident on his phone while others laughed. Following that event, a small group of athletes privately discussed retaliatory payback, framing it as a short scare rather than serious harm. On the evening in question, Darren entered the gym's dry sauna alone after training. At the time, multiple zones of the facility were active, and supervision in the recovery corridor was minimal. 3 athletes later admitted they placed a rigid gym bar and a resistance strap across the outer frame of the sauna door assembly. The obstruction did not rely on locking the door, but interfered with the outward swing and latch clearance, effectively preventing normal egress from inside. They then left the corridor, believing the situation would be noticed quickly. Darren initially treated it as a prank, shouting and striking the door. Mobile phone footage later recovered showed brief laughter and recording from outside the corridor before the group dispersed. Within minutes, attention in the gym shifted shifted to an unrelated dispute in another training area, and nobody remained to monitor the sauna corridor. I still don't understand why they left believing it would be noticed quickly. No plan, just sheer assumption. Inside, Darren attempted repeated forced exits. The sauna unit continued operating at high temperature, and investigators later estimated he had been exposed for approximately 50 to 60 minutes before discovery. Witnesses reported intermittent banging, but ambient noise from adjacent training zones masked the sound. The aging sauna unit had no timer, alarm, or emergency release mechanism, and access to the corridor was not formally controlled. Staff assumed the recovery area was unoccupied during the late session. Security footage showed the corridor was not re-entered for roughly an hour. By the time someone finally came to open the door, Darren was unresponsive. Emergency services were called, but he was pronounced dead by the time they arrived. He suffered from hyperthermia and severe dehydration, consistent with prolonged heat exposure. Toxicology found no intoxicants. Digital evidence recovered from mobile devices included messages referring to locking him in for a scare and recording his reaction. Investigators concluded that the decision to lock him in was deliberate and that the risk of serious harm was something anyone could have clearly seen coming. 3 athletes were arrested and later charged with gross negligence manslaughter and false imprisonment. Prosecutors noted that while there was insufficient evidence of murderous intent, the conduct created a clearly dangerous situation that escalated beyond control. Following the case, the gym's operators introduced mandatory internal release handles, timed cutoff systems for sauna units, and revised supervision protocols for all recovery areas. It was November 3, 2017. A rural county road in southern Missouri ran through farmland under cool, clear morning conditions, with dry pavement, light traffic, and gentle curves. Rodney Phlox was 52 years old and worked as a delivery driver. He had been in the profession for over 20 years and was known for his reliability and careful driving habits. He drove an older pickup truck that had been well maintained with no history of mechanical issues. Several months earlier, Rodney had testified in a theft case involving a former coworker. The former coworker was identified as Nathan Kells, age 24. He had been convicted largely based on Rodney's testimony. The conviction resulted in job loss and legal penalties. In the weeks following the trial, Nathan sent threatening messages to Rodney, including one stating that Rodney had ruined his life. Nathan had access to the parking area where Rodney stored his truck overnight. Security cameras covered portions of the lot. The truck was parked in an unsecured section used by multiple drivers. Early that morning, Rodney began his usual delivery route. His truck was equipped with a dash cam that recorded continuously. The route included a downhill curve approximately 3 miles from his starting point. As Rodney approached the curve, he applied the brakes. Moments earlier, the dash cam briefly captured the brake warning light illuminating as hydraulic pressure dropped. The footage showed the brake pedal fully depressed, but the truck failed to respond as expected. The partially cut brake line caused progressive hydraulic loss, reducing braking efficiency unevenly, rather than causing total failure. The front brakes retained limited stopping power, but the system degradation left Rodney unable to slow the vehicle enough to navigate the curve safely. He pumped the brakes repeatedly with minimal effect. The truck continued rolling forward at a reduced but uncontrolled speed. He attempted to downshift and use the emergency brake. The vehicle slowed further, but not enough to navigate the curve safely. The truck drifted off the road and into a shallow ditch on the right side. The terrain caused the vehicle to tip, and it rolled twice before coming to rest on its side. Rodney was not wearing his seatbelt. The dashcam captured him being ejected through the driver's side window during the second roll. He struck the ground and did not move. A passing motorist witnessed the rollover and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 12 minutes. Rodney was unresponsive and showed no vital signs. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma sustained during ejection from the vehicle. Investigators examined the truck and discovered that the rear brake line had been partially cut. The cut was clean and deliberate, designed to degrade braking performance gradually. Brake fluid had leaked slowly, reducing hydraulic pressure over time. Authorities reviewed low-light infrared security footage, showing Nathan entering the lot late that night and crouching near Rodney's rear wheel well. During questioning, he denied tampering but could not explain his presence. Forensic analysis later matched tools in his possession to the brake line cut. He was charged with second-degree manslaughter. Prosecutors argued that his actions were deliberate and motivated by revenge. The evidence included the sabotaged brake line, security footage, threatening messages, and forensic tool analysis. The trial concluded with a conviction. Nathan Kells was convicted of second-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in the Missouri State Prison. Prosecutors emphasized that the gradual brake failure created a foreseeable risk of serious harm, regardless of whether death was the stated goal. The case closed 10 months after the incident. It was July 22, 2017, in a high-rise apartment in New Jersey. The night felt ordinary: warm air, cracked windows, echoing hallways, elevators chimed, traffic hummed, and faint music leaked through walls. Nothing suggesting the building would hold 2 deaths before midnight that same night. Among the tenants were Eric and Dana Wilkes, both 35 years old. They lived on the 15th floor of a mid-rise apartment building. They were newly married and known in the building for loud weekends. Parties ran late, music carried through the stairwells, and noise complaints followed them from the first month. When a downstairs neighbor, Noor Al-Hassan, began filing formal reports, the couple mocked her openly, filming hallway arguments and sharing the clips privately. Management issued fines. The behavior didn't stop. Noor was 29 and worked overnight catering shifts at a major international airport, sleeping during the day on a strict schedule. The parties regularly disrupted her rest. When she complained, harassment escalated. Notes under her door, mocking in the elevator, and recorded confrontations. Management documented the incidents but delayed taking stronger action. By July, tensions were common knowledge. On Friday night, Eric and Dana hosted another gathering. Alcohol flowed, music echoed down the stairwell. Near midnight, guests left. Eric and Dana decided to take trash and recycling down together before bed, choosing the stairwell they regularly used instead of the elevator. CCTV covered the stairwell from the 15th floor to the ground. At 11:39 p.m., Noor entered alone carrying a small bottle, knelt between the 2nd and 3rd floors, and poured a clear liquid across several steps, spreading it evenly before wiping the bottle clean and leaving. Maintenance later identified the liquid as cooking oil from her apartment. At 11:46 p.m., Eric and Dana entered the stairwell from the 15th floor, laughing, each carrying trash bags. Eric descended first. As he stepped onto the oiled section, his foot slipped forward. His center of gravity shifted backward. CCTV captured his arms flailing before he fell hard, striking the back of his head against the concrete edge of a step. He went limp immediately. Dana screamed and rushed down toward him. As she reached the same steps, she lost traction as well. Her feet slid out, and she fell sideways, her upper body twisting awkwardly. She struck the stair rail and collapsed partially on top of Eric. The camera showed her trying to push herself up, slipping repeatedly, her movements slowing as she remained pressed against his body in the stair wall. Within seconds, both stopped moving. No one else entered the stairwell for several minutes. At 12:02 a.m., another tenant opened the stairwell door from the 1st floor, saw the bodies, and ran to call 911. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Eric was pronounced dead at the scene. Dana had no pulse and could not be revived. The medical examiner ruled that Eric died from a fractured skull and massive brain bleeding caused by the backward fall. Dana died from positional asphyxia, her chest and airway compressed against the stairs and Eric's body, with petechial hemorrhages confirming prolonged oxygen deprivation. Investigators reviewed the stairwell footage, documenting the deliberate oil spill and Noor's timing. During questioning, she admitted planning the act as revenge. Noor was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive 30-year terms. The building later installed non-slip treads, expanded camera coverage, and tightened enforcement. Tenants avoided the stairwell for months. It was July 14, 2016. The evening heat in Phoenix, Arizona lingered well after sunset, the kind that pressed down on the city and made breathing feel heavier than normal. In a modest apartment complex on the city's west side, Carmen Torres, a 45-year-old administrative assistant, returned home after a double shift at a medical billing office. Carmen lived alone. Her days were structured and predictable: work, errands, paperwork, sleep. She was known among coworkers for being methodical and uncomplaining, someone who followed procedures because she believed systems only worked if people used them correctly. That mindset had recently pulled her into a conflict she hadn't anticipated. 3 weeks earlier, Carmen had filed a formal complaint with the city after repeated issues with emergency response times in her neighborhood. On 2 separate occasions, she had called 911 for unrelated incidents and waited more than 40 minutes for help. After the second delay, she requested a case review, submitting call timestamps and recordings obtained through a public records request. The complaint referenced operator 412, the dispatcher assigned to both calls, identified only by an operator ID number listed in the records. Monica Reynolds, 42, worked the overnight shift at the Regional Emergency Communications Center. She had been a dispatcher for nearly 9 years and was known internally for her rigid control of calls and tendency to dismiss what she considered non-critical reports. Supervisors had previously counseled her for tone and judgment issues, but staffing shortages kept her on active duty. When Monica learned of the complaint, she took it personally. According to later testimony, she viewed Carmen as a civilian, attempting to interfere with a job she didn't understand. The review threatened disciplinary action and possible reassignment. Consequences Monica blamed entirely on Carmen. On the night of July 14th, Carmen began experiencing sudden chest tightness and difficulty breathing while preparing dinner. She attempted to sit down, but dizziness forced her to the floor. At 9:18 p.m., she called 911. The call connected to Monica's console. Audio recordings later confirmed Carmen's voice was strained but coherent. She reported shortness of breath, radiating chest pain, and numbness in her left arm, symptoms that normally trigger an automatic Priority 1 medical response in the computer-aided dispatch system. Investigators later determined that operator 412 manually entered the call as nervous caller or anxiety-related, bypassing automatic ambulance dispatch and preventing units from being assigned. She asked prolonged follow-up questions unrelated to immediate dispatch, including whether Carmen had a prior anxiety diagnosis or had taken medication, then placed the call on hold for more than 2 minutes as Carmen struggled to respond. Dispatch logs showed no ambulance was assigned during that window. At 9:27 p.m., Carmen's breathing became erratic. Her responses slowed. The call recording captured a faint thud, followed by silence. Despite mandatory protocol requiring an immediate welfare check when a caller becomes unresponsive, operator 412 marked the call as caller disconnected and closed it without dispatching police or medical units. No units were sent. At 10:04 p.m., a neighbor heard a smoke alarm sounding continuously and called emergency services. A different dispatcher sent fire and medical units immediately. Responders forced entry into Carmen's apartment and found her unresponsive on the kitchen floor. Paramedics attempted resuscitation for 21 minutes. Carmen was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later determined the cause of death was an acute myocardial infarction. Investigators noted that timely intervention would have significantly increased her chances of survival. The death initially appeared natural, until Carmen's family requested her 911 call records. An internal review traced operator 412's console activity and CAD entries to Monica Reynolds, confirming she handled the call, falsified its priority classification, delayed dispatch, and closed it in violation of mandatory protocol. Investigators also uncovered the unresolved complaint Carmen had filed weeks earlier. Prosecutors argued the actions were retaliatory, not negligent. Monica Reynolds was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and abuse of public trust, citing deliberate record falsification and failure to initiate a welfare check following internal review and grand jury consideration. She was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. It was September 18th, 2019, a Wednesday night on a wooded property outside Broken Bow, Oklahoma. Severe thunderstorms swept across McCurtain County, which knocked out power lines, leaving the area in complete darkness. Paul Bennett was 52, and he was a luxury real estate investor and exotic animal collector. Online, he posted photographs beside rare servals, caracals, and hybrid jungle cats while boasting about his remote sanctuary. Locals knew the ranch existed, but very few had ever been inside it. Paul paid cash to anyone willing not to ask questions. "I want to be real here. If I see a job like this with cool cash and less questions, trust me, I won't pass on it." One of the people working for Paul was 34 Lena Alvarez. She's divorced and struggling to support her elderly mother who suffered from severe kidney disease and heart complications. Lena operated a small delivery business using an aging refrigerated van to transport raw meat, antibiotics, sedatives, and maintenance supplies across southeastern Oklahoma. Paul contacted her through another supplier and quickly realized she needed money badly enough not to ask questions. At first, the arrangement seemed like a lifesaver. The weekly payments covered her mother's dialysis treatments, medications, and overdue bills. Because of that, Lena ignored the claw marks on steel cages and the growls coming from locked barns because the money kept her mother alive. Over time, Paul became careless and arrogant. He delayed Lena's payments for weeks, then months, while continuing to spend heavily on new fencing, imported animals, and expensive upgrades around the ranch. The unpaid debt eventually reached a large sum. Whenever Lena demanded payment, Paul insulted her and threatened to expose her involvement in the illegal operation if she continued pressuring him. By late August, Lena's mother's condition worsened after doctors discovered complications requiring emergency surgery and specialist treatment. Lena begged Paul for at least part of the money he owed her, reminding him she had protected his operation for years. Instead, he just paid some money that's nothing compared to what she was owed. 3 days later, her mother died in a regional hospital after treatment delays created serious complications. Lena barely spoke during the funeral. Hours later, she saw photographs Paul uploaded online showing exotic cats feeding on imported meat. Her mother is dying, and he's uploading photos of lions eating imported meat. "I genuinely don't know what kind of person does that." From that point, Lena quietly began planning revenge. Despite everything, she continued delivering supplies because Paul's threats to report her to the main authorities made her afraid to leave the operation. On the evening of September 18th, she arrived at the ranch during the storm. Backup generators powered parts of the property, while rainwater flooded the holding areas. Several animals had been agitated for hours due to thunder and repeated electrical failures. After completing her delivery, Lena briefly assisted workers moving supplies before leaving. When no one was looking, she opened the main gate latch to the large cat enclosure. As the storm intensified, Paul moved through the darkened property, checking the enclosures with his torchlight. While walking through a service hallway near the damaged gate, he encountered an escaped lion inside the corridor. The animal had become highly stressed and disoriented by the storm and electrical failures. The lion slammed into Paul at close range, knocking him backward into the concrete wall. As he fell, the animal bit down on his shoulder and upper chest, dragging him several feet across the wet floor. Paul tried to shield his face and push himself away, but the lion struck again in a fast, chaotic burst, clawing and biting while he struggled beneath it. Neighbors heard loud animal noises, crashing metal, and screams before contacting authorities. Emergency responders discovered damaged fencing, blood trails, overturned equipment, and signs of violent struggle near the courtyard. Several animals were recovered roaming the ranch. Others escaped into nearby woodland and had to be euthanized. Because of the danger from surviving cats and unstable electrical systems, Paul's remains were not fully recovered until daylight. Investigators questioned Lena extensively after learning about the unpaid debt and her mother's death. The storm had destroyed most surveillance footage, and floodwater had contaminated fingerprints, but detectives remained convinced she was involved. No witness saw who opened the enclosure, and without physical evidence, they could not build a case. The investigation stalled. Lena later relocated and disappeared from public records. It was on the 22nd of September 2018 in Brisbane, Australia. A house party in the suburbs became the focus of a criminal investigation after a revenge prank designed to frighten a social media personality escalated into a fatal emergency. Ethan Cole, 28 years old, worked as a residential real estate photographer for a Brisbane property marketing company. Outside work, he spent much of his free time producing prank videos for social media, gradually building a modest online following through prank videos. His content content often involved elaborate practical jokes presented as spontaneous reactions. While many viewers found his videos entertaining, several people featured in them described the pranks as humiliating and deliberately distressing, including fake job termination calls, staged breakups, and simulated emergencies. Tensions peaked after Ethan uploaded footage of a friend experiencing what appeared to be a genuine panic attack during a staged kidnapping prank. A small group of friends began planning a way to give Ethan a taste of his own medicine, selecting his annual birthday gathering as the setting. The plan involved masked participants staging a fake robbery, while informed guests played along. Nobody discussed how Ethan might react if he physically resisted, and unknown to most participants, Ethan had recently become deeply concerned about local burglaries in his area. What I find so funny is that the people planning this knew exactly what kind of content he made, and they used it as their template. That right there is an ironic plot twist. On the same evening, around 30 guests attended the party. Shortly after 10 p.m., 3 masked participants approached through a side entrance, while another disabled the exterior lighting. Several guests had been told about the prank. Others had not. At around 10:15, the masked participants pushed through an unlocked rear door, shouting demands that resembled a violent robbery. The performance appeared far more convincing than organizers had anticipated, with guests screaming, furniture knocked over, and many believing the threat was genuine. Rather than recognizing the prank, Ethan attempted to confront one of the masked intruders while directing guests toward safety. During the struggle, Ethan and one participant crashed through a glass patio door and fell onto the concrete outside. A large section of fractured glass penetrated Ethan's upper thigh, severing the femoral artery. Panic immediately replaced the prank. Some of the guests tried to help stop the bleeding, but the cut was too deep. Emergency services were called within minutes, with responding officers initially believing they were attending an active violent burglary after receiving multiple calls reporting masked offenders. Despite emergency treatment and rapid transport to hospital, Ethan died from catastrophic blood loss. Police quickly determined the event had been staged after reviewing mobile phone messages, planning discussions, and video recordings recovered from guests. Investigators found no evidence that participants had no intent to seriously injure Ethan, but concluded they had knowingly created circumstances in which a reasonable person would believe a violent home invasion was occurring. Several organizers were prosecuted for negligent conduct and dangerous acts resulting in death. Prosecutors argued that simulating a violent robbery inside an occupied home created an obvious risk of resistance and serious injury. Investigators concluded the fatal outcome resulted from a predictable human response to a perceived life-threatening threat rather than any planned act of violence. It was September 22, 2015. A public hiking overlook in Northern California traced the edge of a rugged cliff above the valley below. Clear skies and light winds had drawn photographers to the site throughout the afternoon. A low, thigh-high safety barrier marked the edge, serving as a visual boundary rather than a physical restraint. Beyond it, the terrain dropped roughly 140 feet to a rocky base. Garrick Jope, 41, arrived early to set up his drone. He was an experienced aerial photographer who regularly worked near cliff edges to capture footage others avoided. Friends described him as meticulous with his equipment and openly dismissive of people he viewed as careless or incompetent. Weeks earlier, a business deal had collapsed after Garrick publicly criticized his partner, Miles Reardon, for mismanagement. The fallout was visible and personal. Reardon, 38, took the humiliation badly. Text messages sent in the following week showed escalating hostility. In several of them, he warned Garrick that he would be made to panic and that he would regret embarrassing the wrong person. The messages stopped days before the incident. That afternoon, Reardon arrived at the overlook separately, carrying a small handheld air horn. Park staff were not stationed in that section, and only a handful of tourists were scattered along the trail. Investigators later determined Reardon had chosen the overlook deliberately, aware that the low barrier and exposed drop made sudden loss of balance near the edge, likely to result in serious injury or death. Garrick stood near the barrier, leaning forward as he adjusted the drone controller. The aircraft hovered steadily above the valley, recording uninterrupted footage. His attention remained fixed on the live feed. Reardon approached from behind, moving quietly along the curved path. He stopped several feet away, raised the air horn, and waited until Garrick leaned further over the barrier. The air horn sounded directly behind him. Garrick recoiled violently. His body jerked backward, then forward as he tried to regain balance. His center of gravity was already over the edge, one foot caught against the base of the barrier as he twisted. Momentum carried his torso into the rail, and his weight tipped past it. The drone footage captured the fall from above. Garrick struck a rocky ledge partway down, then continued falling until his body impacted the base of the cliff. Tourists farther along the trail heard the air horn, but did not witness the fall. Reardon left the area within minutes. The overlook's curved layout shielded the cliff edge from casual view, and no one immediately noticed what had happened. Nearly an hour later, another hiker saw the abandoned drone controller near the barrier and looked over the edge. Emergency services were contacted, but the terrain delayed access. A recovery team reached Garrick several hours later and pronounced him dead at the scene. The cause of death was blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from a significant height. The drone later descended automatically and was recovered near the base of the cliff. Investigators reviewed its footage, which clearly showed Reardon approaching with the air horn and Garrick's reaction. Purchase records tied the device to Reardon, and prior threatening messages were recovered. During questioning, Reardon admitted to activating the air horn but claimed he had not intended Garrick to fall. Authorities determined the act was reckless, retaliatory, and carried a foreseeable risk of fatal harm. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years in California State Prison. The drone footage served as primary evidence. The case closed 8 months later. It was August 14, 2014, in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina. Humidity clung to the air as crews arrived before sunrise to prepare a critical beam lift. Streets were closed, traffic diverted, and local news cameras waited across 4th Street, broadcasting the courthouse annex project live that morning. Daniel Brown had supervised construction sites for more than 2 decades, rising from general laborer to site foreman through a mix of technical skill and political leverage. At 47, he still maintained active certifications on heavy equipment, partly out of pride and partly to project authority. Brown was known inside the company for pushing jobs ahead of schedule, often by taking control himself when delays threatened. Since his son, Marcus Brown, 28, joined the company as a rigger 2 years earlier, Brown increasingly treated safety objections as personal challenges rather than operational concerns. The tower crane stood 180 feet tall and was rated for loads up to 12,000 pounds. That morning's lift involved an 8,200-pound steel beam spanning 40 feet. Overnight rain softened the ground, and winds gusted near operator limits, but Brown dismissed concerns and ordered the lift to proceed. Aaron Young, 38, had been a certified crane operator for 11 years before his termination 6 weeks earlier. He was fired after submitting repeated safety complaints involving rigging practices overseen by Marcus Brown. Young documented skipped inspections and improper load handling. Instead of corrective action, he was removed for workplace disruption and escorted off-site. Former co-workers later said Young took the firing personally, viewing it as retaliation that ended his career. In the days leading up to the lift, Young returned to the site after hours under the pretense of collecting personal tools left behind. Investigators later determined that during this access window, the crane's load moment indicator, a system designed to limit swing under unstable conditions, had been deliberately bypassed. The alteration did not prevent operation, but removed a critical safeguard meant to dampen swing under unstable wind conditions. The change was subtle enough to evade routine morning checks. On the morning of the lift, a temporary operator had been scheduled. Shortly before work began, Brown announced he would operate the crane himself, citing familiarity with the site and the presence of media. As the beam was raised and moved laterally over 4th Street, a strong gust struck the suspended load. Without the disabled safeguard compensating for the swing, the oscillation escalated rapidly. Witnesses described the boom whipping sideways as the oscillation intensified. The slewing unit failed, and the upper structure rotated violently before descending. The operator cab dropped toward the street, striking the pavement with catastrophic force. Live news footage captured the cab collapsing inward on impact. Brown remained strapped into the seat as the cab was crushed, pinning his torso against the control panel. Construction workers and pedestrians witnessed the impact. A worker on the ground called 911 at approximately 10:47 a.m. Emergency responders arrived within 12 minutes, but Brown was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner reported multiple rib fractures, massive internal bleeding, and crushing injuries to the chest and abdomen. Death was immediate, caused by traumatic shock and respiratory failure. Toxicology testing was negative. OSHA later cited coastal construction for operating under unsafe wind conditions and for inadequate equipment security. During the investigation, evidence of deliberate tampering emerged. Aaron Young was arrested months later, charged with sabotage and second-degree murder, and later sentenced to federal prison. Marcus Brown resigned and left the industry. The site reopened under new management, with expanded access controls and mandatory end-of-day equipment checks. It was August 14th, 2017. The Shenzhen construction site stood 43 stories tall against the humid morning sky in China. Liang Wei, a 36-year-old senior foreman for a major Chinese construction firm, arrived at 6:30 in the morning to begin his daily inspection routine, unaware that a bundle of steel beams would end his life before lunch. Liang had spent 14 years working his way up from general laborer to senior foreman, earning respect for his meticulous attention to safety protocols. He carried a weathered inspection notebook everywhere, documenting rigging errors, load calculations, and equipment defects that others overlooked. His technical expertise in crane operations and load mechanics made him valuable, but also created friction with supervisors who prioritized speed over safety. Construction crane work involves coordinating massive suspended loads using steel cables and rigging systems, where a single failed connection point can send tons of material plummeting to the ground below, requiring constant vigilance and adherence to load capacity limits, and mandatory rigging inspections that were often violated under deadline pressure. 3 weeks earlier, Liang had filed a formal complaint against Supervisor Chen Rong, 40, after discovering falsified rigging inspection reports on Chen's crew. The complaint triggered an internal investigation that threatened Chen's position. Co-workers later recalled increasing hostility between the two men, including a heated argument in the site office 2 days before the accident, where Chen accused Liang of sabotaging his career. That Monday morning, Chen authorized movement of a load, a 6-ton bundle of steel I-beams, along the North Corridor. Fully aware, Liang conducted his daily inspections along that exact path between 11 o'clock in the morning and noon, and deliberately scheduling the lift during that window. The rigging pins required regular visual inspections. Chen's crew had not performed the mandated checks in over a week, and a fatigue crack had developed inside one of the rigging pins, not visible during routine visual checks, and only exposed once the load was placed under full tension. Liang began his inspection route that morning, moving methodically through the construction zone with his notebook. Site rules forbade workers from passing beneath suspended lifts, but that corridor had been left open that morning to speed traffic. Multiple workers saw him walking the North Corridor, checking welding points and measuring clearances. Minutes later, Chen ordered his crane operator to reposition the steel bundle along the same corridor, creating a narrow window, where Liang would pass directly beneath the suspended load. The operator radioed for confirmation, specifically noting workers were still using the corridor, and was told to proceed by Chen. At 11:38 in the morning, the compromised rigging pin failed catastrophically. The 6-ton steel bundle detached from its mounting points, swinging violently off-center before dropping straight down. A fixed high-mast CCTV camera overlooking the North Corridor recorded the load's swing and the moment of detachment. Witness statements and the inspection notebook filled in the rest of the timeline. CCTV footage and witness statements later indicated Liang reacted to the sound of snapping metal moments before impact. The steel bundle struck him directly in the chest with the full force of gravity, crushing him instantly against the concrete floor. The impact was devastating. Workers 20 feet away saw Liang's body crumple beneath the load, blood spreading rapidly across the concrete. Site medics reached him within minutes. Municipal responders followed shortly after, but Liang showed no vital signs. The medical examiner determined death was instantaneous from polytrauma caused by high-impact crushing injury. The construction site was immediately shut down by municipal authorities. Chen claimed equipment failure during questioning, but investigators recovered CCTV footage showing the timeline. Chen was later convicted of intentional homicide under Chinese criminal law and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the court citing retaliatory motive, safety violations, and deliberate scheduling of the lift as key factors. It was October 14, 2018, evening, inside a crowded church in Parramatta, Sydney, Australia. Guests filled wooden pews while soft music echoed through the building during the wedding ceremony. Fiona Blanco, who was 26, had spent 3 years with Frederick Chu, who was 30. Frederick on the outside appeared charming and successful, but behind closed doors, the relationship was abusive and controlling. He insulted Fiona at the slightest opportunity, monitored her movements, and became violent during arguments. One assault left her seriously injured and required surgery after several days hospitalized. Fiona finally left him and relocated to Melbourne to rebuild her life. Months later, Fiona found work at a finance firm and slowly began moving forward. Frederick became furious after discovering she had left him for good. During their relationship, he had secretly recorded intimate videos and private moments without her knowledge. Unable to locate her directly, he began uploading the recordings online anonymously and sending them to people connected to her personal and professional life. Co-workers discovered the material. The recordings spread through social media, private chats, and workplace gossip. Fiona begged Frederick over the phone to stop, but he continued distributing additional recordings. The harassment destroyed her life within months. Her employer pressured her to resign after co-workers and clients discussed the leaked material. She left an abusive relationship, rebuilt her life, got a job, and he followed her there with recordings. I want to be honest, toxic relationships never leave you the same. The stench follows you for a long time. Fiona struggled to find another job because the recordings continued circulating online. She became increasingly withdrawn and depressed as strangers mocked and harassed her through anonymous messages. Eventually, she was forced into unstable casual work while avoiding public attention. Nearly a year later, Fiona learned from an old acquaintance that Frederick was getting married. She traveled alone to Sydney several days before the ceremony. Investigators later believed she had obtained a handgun illegally through black market contacts, though the exact source was never confirmed. On the evening of the wedding, Fiona entered the church quietly while guests focused on the altar. As Frederick and his bride stood before the priest exchanging vows, Fiona walked down the center aisle carrying a handgun concealed inside her bag. Several guests initially assumed she was a late arrival until she stopped near the front rows and called Frederick's name. Gunshots was heard through the church. Fiona fired 4 times at close range. I keep thinking about the moment everyone in that church understood what was about to happen. But for real, was he really expecting a happily ever after? He must be dreaming. The first shot struck Frederick in the chest. She fired twice as he fell, hitting his bride in the abdomen and shoulder. Guests screamed and rushed toward the exits. Frederick collapsed onto the altar steps. His bride fell backward against the priest. Before anyone near the front could reach Fiona, she turned the weapon on herself and fired once. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. Fiona and Frederick were transported to a hospital, where both later died from their injuries. His bride died in hospital several hours later. Investigators confirmed that Frederick had used several false identities online to hide his involvement, complicating efforts to remove the content and gather evidence. It was February 2018, somewhere off the coastline of Goa, India, where a chartered dive vessel sat anchored approximately 3 miles from shore above a recreational reef, and where a man who had come looking for a fresh start was already wearing sabotaged equipment. Rohan Mehta was 36 years old, a co-founder of a marine tourism company. The company specialized in guided scuba diving experiences for foreign tourists along western India's coastal regions, achieving moderate success through partnerships with beachfront resorts and seasonal diving tours around Goa's reef sites. As time went on, disagreements grew inside the company over how equipment was being maintained and whether safety procedures were being followed properly. Rohan eventually accused his partners of faking inspection records and misusing company money. The accusations became public and destroyed the company's reputation, forcing it to shut down completely. People who knew the group later said that the remaining partners held Rohan personally responsible for everything they had lost. Despite years of hostility, communication resumed in early 2018 when a former partner invited Rohan to a fresh start meeting aboard a licensed charter vessel operating 3 miles offshore near a reef site. The invitation had been framed as a reconciliation, a chance to settle old disputes and discuss new ventures, and Rohan had accepted. At some point before the dive began, while equipment sat unattended near the rear rack of the vessel, one member of the group partially loosened a low-pressure hose connection on Rohan's alternate regulator. Court testimony later suggested the intention was to frighten and humiliate him underwater, to force an aborted dive, to make him feel, as deleted messages would later confirm, what helpless feels like. Nobody anticipated a tragedy. The dive began normally during the late morning, the group descending along a reef wall in calm conditions with visibility of around 10 to 12 meters. For roughly 20 minutes, nothing appeared wrong. Then Rohan began signaling. A loosened connection had been progressively destabilizing his airflow, and as his breathing resistance increased, so did his exertion and stress. The current was now pulling the group further from the ascent line above. Sediment stirred up near the seabed clouded the water and made it nearly impossible to see clearly during the ascent. The group began drifting apart, and one diver's attempt to share an alternate air source with Rohan became difficult to maintain in the murky conditions. Controlled ascent procedures broke down under the compounding pressure of drift, separation, restricted breathing, and rising panic. Rohan lost consciousness before reaching the surface. The people on that boat knew he would panic. That was the point. I think they just did not understand how fatal even a minor scuba interference can become fatal once panic steps in. Recovery personnel retrieved him from the water shortly afterward and transported him back to shore, where emergency resuscitation efforts were unsuccessful. Forensic inspection later identified interference inconsistent with normal equipment wear, and deleted messages were recovered referencing deliberate plans to make him panic underwater. The investigation shifted from accidental fatality to criminal sabotage. All 3 former partners were arrested and prosecuted. Prosecutors argued that deliberately interfering with life support equipment in an underwater environment constituted reckless disregard for human life, regardless of what the group had intended. Marine safety specialists confirmed that even relatively minor scuba system interference can become fatal once panic and disorientation develop at depth. It was August 9, 2017. Central Arizona baked under the afternoon sun. The temperature had climbed past 112 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-afternoon. Heat radiated off the asphalt and concrete in visible waves. The air was dry and still, offering no relief. A small rental duplex sat at the end of a quiet residential street, its exterior walls absorbing the relentless heat. Veena Crum was 27 years old and worked part-time providing childcare assistance. She was known as reliable and cautious, someone who followed routines and avoided unnecessary risks. She lived in the duplex with her young child and had recently filed multiple complaints about the property. She had also reported the property caretaker for harassment. Eric Halden was a 32-year-old man responsible for repairs and tenant issues across several units. His employment contract explicitly required a 24/7 response for lockouts involving children or emergencies. Their interactions had grown hostile after her complaints. Days before, he had sent her a message warning that she would regret making trouble. The duplex had an exterior door with an automatic lock that was known to jam in extreme heat. The caretaker had recently disabled the spare key access without notifying tenants. That afternoon, Veena returned home from shopping. She stepped inside briefly, then went back outside to retrieve something from the car. The door closed behind her and locked automatically. The lock had jammed. Her phone was in the car. She retrieved it and immediately called the caretaker. He did not answer. She called again. No response. A neighbor's motion-activated security camera captured her attempting to force the door open with her shoulder, throwing her full weight against it repeatedly. She tried the windows, but they were locked from the inside. She resumed slamming against the door, exerting herself continuously in direct sunlight. Her hands began to bleed from scraping against the door frame. The concrete driveway and surrounding asphalt amplified the heat. Direct sunlight reflected off every surface. There was no shade. Veena's movements became slower. She sat down briefly, then stood and resumed forcing the door, her breathing visible and labored. She tried calling neighbors, but most were at work. The footage showed her leaning against the door between efforts, her posture weakening. The camera recorded her collapsing near the door. She did not get back up, Inside, her child could be seen through the window crying. A neighbor eventually noticed and called emergency services. Paramedics arrived and forced entry. Vina was unresponsive. They pronounced her dead at the scene. Her child was found dehydrated but alive and was transported to a medical facility for observation. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as heat stroke, with severe dehydration listed as a contributing factor, estimating exposure to extreme heat for 40 to 50 minutes while she repeatedly exerted herself trying to force entry. Investigators reviewed security footage and phone records showing multiple unanswered calls to the caretaker. Maintenance reports confirmed he had previously acknowledged the lock's tendency to jam in extreme heat. Phone data placed him less than 2 blocks away for over 20 minutes during the incident. Text records documented prior threats and her complaints. Authorities concluded his inaction was deliberate and retaliatory. He was convicted of manslaughter by reckless endangerment and sentenced to 6 years in state prison. The property management company faced civil penalties. It was July 22, 2015, when a relentless heat wave gripped the Southwest, pushing temperatures beyond 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The asphalt in a strip mall parking lot radiated waves of heat that distorted the air above its surface. Lila Hart, 29, worked as an assistant manager at a small childcare facility in the strip mall. Known for meticulous attention to detail, Lila had built a reputation for never overlooking safety protocols. 2 weeks earlier, she had filed a formal complaint against a coworker for repeatedly leaving children unattended, resulting in the employee's suspension. That afternoon, Lila parked her dark blue sedan in direct sunlight. Earlier that afternoon, Lila had been temporarily responsible for the 2 toddlers, ages 18 months and 2 years, following an early pickup request. They remained secured in rear-facing car seats when she returned to the strip mall. Exterior security cameras from surrounding businesses captured the parking lot throughout the afternoon. Lila entered the building to complete end-of-shift responsibilities. Inside the air-conditioned building, she worked methodically through her checklist while exterior temperature continued climbing. The sealed vehicle began heating rapidly. Within minutes, interior temperatures surged past 115 degrees Fahrenheit. Subsequent forensic reconstruction determined the children began showing early signs of heat distress within minutes. After approximately 20 minutes, Lila emerged from the building and approached her vehicle, already showing signs of heat stress. The recording showed her fumbling with her key fob and attempting the door handle before staggering beside the driver's door. Her movements became increasingly unsteady as she collapsed onto the superheated asphalt, losing consciousness. The vehicle's driver's side door lock had been deliberately disabled, preventing it from being opened using the key fob. Impaired by heat and sedation, Lila did not attempt alternate entry. Recording continued as heat levels inside reached critical temperatures. The children's movements became more labored as interior temperature climbed toward 140 degrees Fahrenheit. No intervention occurred during the critical window when rescue might have been possible. A customer discovered the scene 25 minutes after Lila's collapse and immediately contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes, but found all 3 victims unresponsive. Despite aggressive cooling measures, all were pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner determined Lila's cause of death was heat-related collapse, complicated by ingestion of a sedating substance that impaired her thermoregulation and mobility. Investigators later determined the sedative had been administered earlier that day through a shared beverage container kept in the staff break area. Toxicology revealed the presence of a sedating compound inconsistent with Lila's medical history. Investigation revealed the suspended co-worker, Carl Smith, 34, had accessed Lila's vehicle using a copied key fob obtained during his employment. Security footage confirmed Smith's presence in the parking lot during lunch hour. During interrogation, inconsistencies in Smith's statements, combined with surveillance footage and forensic evidence, led investigators to determine he had planned to incapacitate Lila and stage a public rescue. He intended to humiliate her professionally while positioning himself as the hero, hoping to get his job back. Smith claimed he was unaware the children were still inside the vehicle and had miscalculated the drug dosage. When he saw Lila collapse, he panicked and fled. Carl Smith was arrested and charged with multiple counts, including second-degree murder and felony manslaughter. He was later convicted and sentenced to multiple life terms in state prison to be served consecutively. The child care facility closed permanently. Exterior security footage, vehicle data logs, and forensic findings provided crucial evidence confirming the deliberate nature of the crime. It was December 9, 2015, at a middle school in Carmel, Indiana. After 4:30 p.m., the building had mostly emptied, leaving only a few staff members finishing end-of-semester tasks, while hallway cameras continued recording every entry and exit for later review. Among the remaining teachers was Harold Harlan, 44, who had spent 14 years teaching 7th grade American history. His classroom was known for rigid discipline and public shaming. He routinely read failing grades aloud, assigned detention for minor behavior, and kept detailed records that parents later described as humiliating. Multiple complaints were filed, but internal reviews found no policy violations, as district anti-bullying rules applied only to students, not teachers. Detention took place in room 127, a former storage room off the main hallway. The space had no windows, a single inward opening door, and relied entirely on the building's central ventilation. It held a few desks, a teacher's table, and metal cabinets occasionally used to store custodial supplies. Policy required the supervising teacher to stay inside with the student, leaving both alone in an enclosed room with little oversight. That afternoon, Harlan assigned detention to Zayden Webb, a 13-year-old student who had received repeated detention since the start of the school year. Webb had been singled out frequently in class, mocked for poor scores, and once kept after school for nearly an hour longer than required, according to later statements from classmates. Security footage showed Webb entering room 127 at 3:45 p.m. and leaving at 4:15 p.m. after signing out. Later footage showed Harlan entering the room at 4:18 p.m. and never exiting. What investigators later uncovered filled in what the cameras could not. Earlier that week, Webb had accessed a custodial supply area and removed a bottle of muriatic acid used for restroom cleaning. During detention, he poured the chemical into an open container inside room 127 and damaged the door handle mechanism using a small tool from his backpack. He then sealed the container inside a cabinet and left the room, knowing Harlan often stayed behind to work alone. At 4:18 p.m., Harlan re-entered the room with papers and a laptop. As the room sat closed, hydrochloric acid vapors slowly filled the space. With no windows and limited airflow, the fumes intensified. Harlan began coughing and experienced rapid throat and lung irritation. As he tried to escape, the damaged door hardware failed. Scratch marks later found on the door, and walls showed repeated attempts to force it open. The acid burned his face, neck, and hands as he struggled to breathe. He collapsed beside his desk as oxygen deprivation worsened. At 5:47 p.m., custodian James Torres noticed a sharp chemical odor in the hallway and traced it to room 127. Inside, he found Harlan unresponsive and immediately called emergency services, as hallway cameras continued recording the first responders entering the room. Responders arrived minutes later, but were unable to revive him. The medical examiner ruled the death an acute respiratory failure caused by prolonged exposure to hydrochloric acid vapors with severe internal and external chemical burns. Investigators later determined the act was deliberate. Webb admitted he wanted Harlan to feel trapped, citing months of public humiliation and fear. He was adjudicated delinquent for an act equivalent to murder and sentenced to confinement in a state juvenile facility until age 21. The school permanently closed room 127, revised detention policies to require multiple staff, and removed chemical storage from instructional areas. It was February 12, 2018. The winter air in Helsinki, Finland was typical for the season, hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside a downtown fitness center, Mikko Laine, a 33-year-old gym supervisor, arrived for his evening shift unaware that a workplace conflict he'd dismissed would escalate into his final hours. Mikko had worked in fitness management for 9 years, climbing from personal trainer to supervisor at one of Helsinki's mid-tier gym chains. He was known for his rigid management style and zero-tolerance approach to maintenance violations. Friends described him as efficient but abrasive, someone who prioritized protocols over people. His personnel file showed multiple complaints about his confrontational methods, particularly toward junior staff. 2 weeks earlier, he'd formally reprimanded Jari Koskinen, a 28-year-old maintenance worker, for leaving cleaning supplies unsecured, threatening termination for future violations. Co-workers later told investigators that Jari became openly resentful afterward, repeatedly stating Mikko had ruined his job and would pay for it. The reprimand was logged in the facility's internal incident system and acknowledged electronically by Jari. The Finnish sauna ran between 160 and 180 degrees Fahrenheit, controlled by decade-old electric heaters with a manual panel in the maintenance corridor. Staff were required to monitor use and ventilation, but records showed the high-temperature cutoff had been flagged as unreliable that month. The wooden door had been improperly fitted with a non-standard maintenance restraint, a temporary service bar not intended for occupied use, creating a severe safety hazard if misused. That evening, Jari approached Mikko at 6:45 in the afternoon, claiming the sauna needed immediate deep cleaning before peak hours. Mikko agreed to inspect the space first, entering the 8-by-10-foot chamber while Jari gathered supplies. The ventilation vent inside the sauna had been partially blocked due to ongoing cleaning preparations, reducing airflow. The facility's incident report later confirmed that Jari deliberately locked the door's exterior bolt once Mikko was inside, then remained briefly in the maintenance corridor, adjusting the heater controls before leaving the area entirely, despite knowing the sauna was occupied. Mikko initially didn't notice the locked door, assuming Jari would return momentarily. By 7:05 in the afternoon, the temperature had climbed past 190 degrees Fahrenheit, well beyond safe operating levels. Witness timelines later suggested Mikko attempted to exit multiple times as the heat intensified, discovering the door wouldn't budge. He pounded on the thick wooden door, but the sauna's dense wood construction and continuous ambient noise from the gym's sound system masked any noise. The facility's CCTV footage, installed only in public hallways under company privacy policy, captured Mikko's hand briefly appearing in the door's small window before disappearing. At approximately 7:20 in the afternoon, Mikko collapsed forward onto the wooden bench. The extreme heat had caused severe dehydration and disorientation within minutes, his core body temperature rising rapidly. His body temperature reached critical levels, triggering organ stress and cardiac irregularities. The compromised ventilation and sustained heater output prevented meaningful cooling, accelerating his physical deterioration. He remained motionless on the bench as the temperature stabilized around 195 degrees Fahrenheit due to the heater continuing to cycle without an effective cutoff. A gym member attempting to use the sauna at 8:30 in the afternoon noticed the locked door and unusual heat radiating through the wood. After failing to open it, she alerted the front desk staff. Front desk logs later confirmed no scheduled maintenance was authorized at that hour. Employees forced the door open at 8:42 in the afternoon, discovering Mikko unconscious and unresponsive. Emergency services arrived within 9 minutes, but paramedics pronounced him dead at the scene. The autopsy determined Mikko died from fatal hyperthermia, complicated by severe dehydration, cardiovascular collapse, and heat stroke-induced heart arrhythmia. The CCTV footage became crucial evidence, showing Jari locking the door and being present near the heater control area shortly before the temperature spike, with timestamps matching maintenance logs and front desk records. Digital footage metadata was preserved by investigators to maintain chain of custody. Police arrested him 4 days later on homicide charges. He was later convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the court citing deliberate confinement, manipulation of the sauna's safety systems, and retaliatory motive. It was the afternoon of the 14th of December, 2017, at a private marina near Cairns, Australia. Tourists walked along the docks while dark storm clouds gathered over the Coral Sea during cyclone season. Despite repeated marine warnings, several charter boats still prepared to leave the harbor. Trevor Mallory was 48 and owned a charter company. He had built a profitable business offering private island cruises and sunset trips across the region. Former employees described him as reckless and obsessed with money during holiday season, often ignoring dangerous weather to avoid refunding customers. Local harbor authorities had already issued multiple storm warnings that day. Several experienced captains refused to operate tours because of dangerous wave forecasts and worsening conditions. Jacques, 32, and Kyle McGraw, 27, were newly engaged tourists from the United Kingdom. The trip was supposed to celebrate their engagement before returning home for Christmas. Several passengers asked staff whether conditions were safe before boarding. Heavy rain and strong winds had already begun hitting the marina. Employees were allegedly instructed to reassure customers that weather would clear once the boat reached open water. Multiple captains refused to go out that day. Trevor sent a 24-year-old deckhand instead and told staff to reassure the passengers. I don't have the words for that decision. Hours before departure, Mallory claimed he was too ill to captain the vessel and assigned 24-year-old deckhand Liam to operate the boat. Liam possessed only limited offshore navigation experience and had never captained a vessel alone during severe storm conditions. Shortly after leaving the marina, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Massive waves slammed against the vessel while visibility disappeared beneath heavy rain and violent winds. Passengers screamed as water crashed across the deck and the boat struggled to remain stable. Jacques attempted to shield Kyle as the vessel struck a reef and began taking on water. Distress calls were received less than an hour after departure before communication stopped. Rescue helicopters searched through the night. Wreckage was discovered the following morning, scattered across reefs several kilometers offshore. All passengers and crew drowned, including Jacques and Kyle. Authorities launched a major investigation into the disaster. Witness statements, weather reports, and company records revealed that multiple storm warnings had been ignored before departure. Mallory faced possible criminal negligence charges, as families accused him of prioritizing profit over safety. Kyle's two brothers had confronted Mallory multiple times in the months afterward, blaming him directly for the deaths. Mallory showed little remorse and repeatedly blamed the victims for boarding the trip. In September 2018, Mallory disappeared after leaving the marina late one evening. His abandoned vehicle was discovered near a remote boat ramp north of Cairns. Kyle's brothers ambushed Mallory late that night near the isolated boat ramp after he arrived alone and forced him onto a rented small boat. Mallory was restrained and thrown into deep water miles from shore. He struggled against the restraints as cold ocean water filled his lungs, but he drowned. Phone records, marina surveillance footage, and GPS data from the rented boat connected the brothers to the disappearance. Both were arrested and charged. During trial, the court found out that it was a planned act of revenge driven by grief and anger over deaths caused by Mallory's reckless decisions. It was the evening of May 26, 2017, in a mid-sized college town in Florida, and the streets were quiet as Daniel Mercer walked alone along a familiar pavement at around 7 in the evening, a routine route he had taken many times without concern. Daniel Mercer, 25 years old, was an IT support technician known among his former university friends for frequent teasing and joking that sometimes went too far, leaving some people embarrassed or humiliated. After graduation, the group stayed loosely connected, but relationships soured after an online incident in which private disagreements were made public, causing lasting resentment toward Daniel. Over time, several former friends began privately discussing a revenge prank. What they eventually called it was a controlled fear scenario, a staged abduction intended to scare him and then reveal it as a prank. They had talked about it in pieces over several weeks, but never properly planned it out. There were no safety boundaries, no guidelines for how to restrain him, and no abort plan. One member had raised concerns, but the rest of the group brushed them aside. Someone in that van knew this was wrong before it started, said so, and was outvoted. I wonder how that person has lived with that since. On the night itself, they used an older, poorly maintained black van with a rear sliding door that did not always latch cleanly unless slammed shut. All of them wore masks for the effect, and when Daniel reached a quiet stretch of road, they pulled up abruptly. They moved fast, grabbing him before he could fully react, forcing him into the back, covering his head and binding his wrists. The door slid shut and the van pulled into traffic. traffic, accelerating toward the highway and heading out of town toward a rural location where they planned to reveal the prank. Daniel believed he had been kidnapped. With his vision blocked and his hands restrained, panic took over instantly and completely. As he struggled violently inside the moving van, his body slammed against the rear door as the vehicle moved at highway speed. What none of them had assigned was responsibility for the rear compartment. The van rear door was not properly latched, and as Daniel's struggling weight pushed against it in the midst of the chaos, it slid open and he fell onto the highway without warning. A passing vehicle struck him almost instantly. The driver had no time to react. The impact caused severe multi-system trauma, critical head injury, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures across the torso and limbs. The van ahead screeched to a stop as the group realized what had happened. For a short period, there was confusion and panic inside the vehicle. Arguments broke out, disbelief set in, and it took several minutes before anyone called emergency services. For several minutes, nobody called emergency services. They were arguing instead. I have sat with that detail for a long time, and I still cannot find a way to make it less than what it is. When paramedics arrived, Daniel was still alive, though in critical condition. He was stabilized at the scene and transported urgently to the hospital. Despite intervention, his injuries were unsurvivable, and Daniel Mercer died later that night. Investigators reconstructed the incident through vehicle examination, phone records, and witness statements. They concluded there was no murderous intent, but the actions constituted a clearly foreseeable chain of reckless behavior. Unlawful restraint in a moving vehicle at highway speed with no safety controls. The group faced charges including unlawful confinement, reckless endangerment, and negligent homicide. The court made clear that good intentions did not remove responsibility when the risks involved were obvious and could easily have been prevented. In the end, what began as resentment hardened into something far more irreversible, not because anyone planned a death, but because no one planned anything at all. It was April 17th, 2018. A suburban home renovation site in Ohio sat quiet in the mid-morning. The weather was clear and dry, with temperatures in the low 60s. A two-story house was undergoing exterior work, with scaffolding and equipment scattered across the front yard. The neighborhood was residential and calm. A shared storage shed sat between two properties, accessible to multiple households. Macy Twine was 36 years old and worked as a freelance painter. She had built a reputation for quality work and attention to detail. Colleagues described her as professional and methodical, someone who followed safety protocols. She had been hired to paint the exterior of the home and had been on the job for 3 days. Macy lived next door to Caleb Rourke, who had grown increasingly hostile toward her over the past several months. The tension began after she filed multiple noise complaints with local authorities regarding late-night disturbances from his property. The complaints had resulted in warnings and fines. He had sent her messages in response, including one that warned her to watch her step. The shared shed between their properties housed tools and equipment for both households. Macy stored her fiberglass extension ladder there, along with other painting supplies. Caleb had access to the same shed. That morning, Macy retrieved her ladder from the shed to continue work on the upper sections of the house. The ladder was a standard extension model, approximately 20 feet when fully extended. It relied on locking pins to secure the upper section in place. A doorbell camera from across the street had captured Caleb entering the shed earlier that morning. Macy positioned the ladder against the house siding on firm, level ground. She extended it fully and checked the base for stability. She climbed slowly, carrying a paint tray and brush. As she reached approximately 14 feet, one of the upper locking pins gave way. The pin had been partially backed out and weakened, allowing the connection to fail under load. The extension section collapsed downward. Macy lost her grip and fell backward, striking the concrete driveway below. She landed on her back with her head and neck taking the primary impact. She did not move after hitting the ground. A neighbor who had been retrieving mail saw the fall and immediately called emergency services. Paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. Macy was unresponsive and showed no signs of breathing. They pronounced her dead at the scene. The cause of death was severe head and neck trauma, consistent with a fall from height. Investigators examined the ladder and found that one locking pin had been partially backed out and weakened, allowing collapse under load. The mechanism showed signs of tampering, with tool marks visible on the metal components. Authorities reviewed footage from the doorbell camera. The recording showed Caleb entering the shed approximately 30 minutes before Macy arrived. Investigators also recovered the threatening messages he had sent. During questioning, Caleb denied tampering with the ladder, but could not explain his presence in the shed that morning. Tool marks on the ladder matched a wrench found in his garage. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter under Ohio law. Prosecutors argued that his actions were deliberate and motivated by retaliation for the noise complaints. The evidence included the tampered ladder, doorbell footage, threatening messages, and forensic analysis. The trial concluded with a conviction. The court determined that the tampering was intentional and that he had knowingly created a life-threatening situation. Macy's death was ruled a direct result of his actions. Caleb Rourke was sentenced to 8 years in Ohio State Prison. The court cited deliberate equipment tampering as an aggravating factor. The case closed 11 months after the incident. Thanks for watching. Want to see more? Click on your screen now. It was November 11th, 2013 in Laredo, Texas, inside a small auto repair shop along a border service road. Mild weather kept the bay doors open and radios playing as customers came and went. The evening felt routine, with nothing on the surface suggesting the strain that had been building behind the scenes. The tension focused on Miguel Santos, who was 40 and known as the guy the shop leaned on when work ran late. He stayed after hours, followed the rules, and handled repairs others didn't want. Outside the shop, he picked up overtime and coached youth soccer to support his infant twin daughters. That balance fell apart after he reported a co-worker, Daniel Jones, 38, for stealing tools and selling them off-site. Management confirmed the theft and issued a warning, and from then on, the atmosphere in the shop changed. The argument started soon after. Daniel accused Miguel of snitching and costing everyone money. Other mechanics overheard shouting near the tool cages and service bays. Managers tried to keep them on separate shifts, but short staffing meant they still crossed paths. Security cameras recorded several heated encounters in the weeks before the incident, including one where Daniel told Miguel he would regret it. On Veterans Day evening, Miguel stayed late to finish a suspension repair on a luxury SUV. Most of the staff had already left. Daniel remained on the clock in a nearby bay, assigned routine cleanup. Security cameras showed Miguel lifting the SUV and positioning himself underneath to secure the final bolts. The lift arms were correctly set, the safety locks engaged, and the vehicle was stable. At 8:56 p.m., Daniel walked into Miguel's bay without speaking. Miguel continued working beneath the vehicle, focused on the suspension. Daniel stood near the control column for several seconds, watching. Then, without any exchange or warning, he reached out, pulled the safety lock release, and held the hydraulic control down. The lift dropped immediately. With the safety locks released, the SUV dropped several feet. Miguel screamed as the chassis slammed onto his chest and shoulders. The impact crushed his rib cage inward, forced the air from his lungs, and pinned him to the concrete. Blood spread beneath his body as his legs kicked and scraped against the floor, then slowed. Daniel stepped back, froze for a moment, then turned and ran out of frame. The vehicle continued to settle unevenly, fully trapping Miguel beneath it. His arms were pinned, his head pressed sideways against the concrete. His mouth opened and closed as his chest failed to rise. His legs twitched briefly, then went still as all movement stopped. At 9:18 p.m., a passerby noticed blood pooling under the bay door and called 911. Paramedics arrived 11 minutes later and found Miguel unresponsive, chest compressed beneath the SUV. Additional lifting equipment was required to raise the vehicle. Miguel went into cardiac arrest during extrication and was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The medical examiner ruled the cause of death as crush asphyxia due to massive chest compression, which collapsed both lungs and prevented oxygen from reaching the heart. Investigators reviewed the footage and confirmed the lever had been intentionally engaged while Miguel was underneath the vehicle. Daniel Jones was arrested and charged with murder, a first-degree felony. He was later convicted and sentenced to 60 years in state prison. The shop closed within 6 months amid criminal proceedings and civil lawsuits. Miguel's twin daughters were raised with the help of extended family. It was January 16, 2014. The morning air in Patna, India, was thick. Breakfast preparation was underway in the kitchen of a small private boarding school, steam rising from aluminum pots as rice and lentils cooked for fewer than 60 resident students. Ramesh Singh, a 45-year-old cook who had worked in the school's kitchen for 8 years, wasn't supposed to be there that morning. He'd been terminated 3 weeks earlier after repeated complaints about hygiene violations and showing up drunk during meal preparation. The district education officer had finally acted on the headmistress's formal complaint, ending Ramesh's employment without severance. Colleagues said that Ramesh blamed the headmistress entirely for his firing. They said that he'd told them he worked there longer than she had, and the dismissal meant losing his small income and facing shame in his neighborhood. For 3 weeks, he'd watched from across the street as the replacement cook arrived each morning. He knew the kitchen routine perfectly, the unlocked side entrance that had no guard during early morning hours, and the chaos of morning preparation when nobody paid attention to who came and went. That morning, a student noticed Ramesh slipped into the kitchen at approximately 10:45 in the morning, carrying a small bottle containing approximately 30 milliliters of concentrated organophosphate pesticide, telling the clerk he needed it for crop treatment. The current cook had stepped outside to receive the vegetable delivery. Ramesh moved quickly to the nearly finished dal pot, pouring the entire bottle into the simmering lentils, stirring thoroughly so it dissolved completely and left no visible trace. He was gone within 90 seconds. By late morning, the dining hall filled with younger boarding students who ate their meals together under staff supervision. Teachers distributed steel plates as the dal was ladled over rice. The children, most from families surviving on less than 100 rupees daily, ate eagerly. Within 8 minutes, a 7-year-old girl began vomiting violently, then another child, then 5 more simultaneously. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Children clutched their stomachs, sweating profusely despite the cool weather, their pupils constricted to pinpoints. Several collapsed face first into their plates. Teachers screamed for help, trying to carry convulsing students toward the gate. But 3 teachers also began showing symptoms after tasting the food during service. Parents waiting outside rushed in, finding children unconscious and struggling to breathe. A teacher managed to call emergency services at 12:14 in the afternoon. The nearest hospital was approximately 7 miles away. Private vehicles began evacuating children immediately, but traffic and deteriorating conditions made transport agonizing. 21 students and 3 staff members were transported to nearby hospitals, overwhelming emergency departments unprepared for mass casualty poisoning. 4 children, aged 6 to 9, died within hours from acute respiratory failure, complicated by secondary hypoxic organ injury. The post-mortem examinations revealed severe neurotoxicity, pulmonary edema, and secondary hypoxic damage to multiple organs, consistent with acute organophosphate poisoning. Their small bodies had absorbed lethal concentrations of the pesticide through ingestion, causing their nervous systems to fail, while breathing became impossible. The school's CCTV footage showed Ramesh entering the side entrance with time-stamped grainy images that captured his movement, but not the exact stirring of the dal pot. So investigators still relied on the discarded bottle and vendor receipt to confirm the act. Investigators found the plastic pesticide bottle with a partially legible label, discarded 2 blocks away with his fingerprints partially intact. Ramesh was arrested later that evening. He was later convicted on multiple counts of murder and attempted murder and sentenced to life imprisonment, with the court citing deliberate retaliation and the vulnerability of the victims as aggravating factors. On the 12th of May 2018, a boys' boarding school in Ogun State, Nigeria was operating its regular Saturday routine, with students moving between early sports and hostel cleaning before the mid-morning rest period. Tunde Adebayo, 17, was a senior student known for intimidation of juniors, including confiscation of belongings and verbal threats. While complaints existed, disciplinary response was inconsistent, and senior-junior conflict was often informally managed without strict enforcement. Over time, resentment built among junior junior students, particularly in shared spaces where supervision was limited. After sports activities, students returned to the hostel in a crowded flow, increasing movement along the upper corridors and stair landings. The three-story male hostel consisted of tightly packed corridors linked by stair landings and an upper balcony-style walkway. A section of the outer railing near the staircase landing had been scheduled for maintenance due to corrosion, requiring temporary removal of a short segment during repair work. A group of juniors planned a prank intended to humiliate Tunde by removing his clothes while he showered and recording his reaction as he chased them. The intent was embarrassment, not physical harm. To increase the embarrassment, one student poured some vegetable oil onto the tiled corridor near the staircase landing, expecting Tunde to slip and stumble during the chase and become the subject of ridicule. It formed a thin, uneven, low-visibility film across several feet, reducing traction without being obvious. At the same time, maintenance work was active on the upper walkway adjacent to the stair landing. A short railing section had been removed for repair, and although caution tape was present, it was loosely secured and did not fully block access points. No staff member was actively supervising the area during the transition between work stages, leaving a temporarily exposed edge in an otherwise protected walkway. Shortly after exiting the bathroom, Tunde discovered his clothes missing. The situation escalated quickly as nearby students shouted and moved away, drawing more students into the corridor and increasing congestion and noise. As he pursued them, he moved through a crowded corridor with limited visibility of floor conditions. He stepped onto the low-friction area and lost traction. His attempt to recover balance failed as his motion became unstable, and he collided with the corridor wall, redirecting his momentum toward the stair landing and adjacent walkway edge. He entered the partially isolated maintenance zone and fell through the unguarded gap where the railing section had been removed, dropping from the upper level to the floor below. He sustained severe head and multiple traumatic injuries. Emergency response was immediate, and he was transported for treatment but was pronounced dead before arrival at hospital. The juniors who took his clothes were only trying to embarrass him, not hurt him. I am certain nobody foresaw this outcome. It's unimaginable. Investigators concluded there was no intent to cause serious injury or death. However, the actions were classified as reckless due to the foreseeable risks created by forcing a chase through a crowded corridor combined with a reduced traction surface and proximity to an unprotected structural edge. The outcome was attributed to cumulative negligence and risk convergence rather than a single act or deliberate intent. Following the incident, the school implemented stricter maintenance zone controls, improved physical barrier requirements for elevated walkways, and strengthened supervision and disciplinary response to inter-year conflicts. The case was closed as a preventable fatal accident arising from compounded environmental, behavioral, and procedural failures. It was March 11, 2017, afternoon, inside a packaging factory outside Cebu City in the Philippines. Television crews walked across the noisy production floor during a public event celebrating the company's expansion. Behind the cameras and speeches, workers watched the oldest machines with visible unease. Eduardo Ramirez was 60 and owned the factory. He cared more about production than safety. For years, workers complained about broken emergency shutoffs, damaged conveyor systems, and safety guards removed to run machines faster. Maintenance crews repeatedly warned that machines on line 4 had become unstable and dangerous, but little was done beyond temporary repairs. Workers who raised concerns were threatened with losing overtime. The worst accident happened in August 2016, when 29-year-old machine operator Marco Villanueva became trapped inside a defective roller assembly during a night shift. The emergency stop button failed when co-workers tried to shut the machine down. Marco survived after emergency surgery, but lost his right arm above the elbow. Over the following months, he publicly begged Eduardo Ramirez to improve safety inside the factory and provide compensation. Ramirez dismissed the criticism during interviews and blamed the accident on human error. He also fought parts of Marco's compensation claims in court, leaving him buried in medical debt while unable to work. Marco became deeply depressed from the pain, financial pressure, and humiliation. On November 18, 2016, he was found dead in his apartment, taking his own life. life. Rogelio Bautista was 50 and had worked at the factory for nearly 20 years as senior maintenance technician. Marco was his cousin and had helped him get the job and had personally filed many repair requests management ignored. After Marco's death, Rogelio became consumed with anger toward Ramirez. Let's be real here. I don't think Rogelio slept well for a long time. He obviously lost a family member in this same place that he has to show up for work every single day. That's a lot. In early March 2017, Ramirez announced a major media event to showcase the factory's expansion. Management planned to demonstrate the same unstable production line workers had complained about for months. Days before the event, during late-night maintenance inspection, Rogelio secretly disabled one remaining backup cutoff sensor connected to the emergency stop system. The change did not attract attention because inspections were poorly documented and many safety systems had already been bypassed or left unrepaired. On the afternoon of the event, Ramirez proudly guided his 18-year-old son Miguel across the factory floor while reporters followed. During the demonstration, a blockage formed inside the high-speed conveyor assembly, while Miguel stood beside the production line, speaking with reporters. Operators attempted to stop the machine. The system failed to respond. The jam caused overloaded rollers to misalign and shake violently as the conveyor continued running under pressure. A loud metallic crack split the air. Weakened mounting bolts snapped loose from a heavy steel guide rail. The rail tore free and struck Miguel directly, throwing him backward hard against the machinery platform. His body twisted as the rail hit his upper torso and head. He fell and struck the concrete floor. Debris scattered across the production floor. Reporters and employees ran for cover. Workers screamed for emergency shutdown as others rushed toward Miguel, but the damaged line continued moving for several more seconds before power was cut manually. Paramedics arrived after being called and rushed Miguel Ramirez to a hospital in Cebu City. Eduardo Ramirez was seen crying beside the ambulance, repeatedly begging rescuers to save his only son. He spent years ignoring every complaint about that machine. I watched a video once of a man begging outside a hospital, and I remember thinking, what did you think was going to happen? That feeling came back reading this. Despite emergency treatment, Miguel later died from severe blunt force injuries sustained during the machinery failure. After investigation, Rogelio was arrested and charged with sabotage, reckless homicide, and multiple criminal offenses. Authorities launched separate investigations into factory management and workplace safety violations tied to Eduardo Ramirez. The factory was shut down pending further proceedings. It was January 17, 2018, at Whistler Blackcomb in British Columbia. Low fog flattened depth, wind hardened slabs, and patrol posted warnings. Yet by mid-morning, crowds moved normally, masking danger. One of the skiers on the slope was Lena Park, who was 26 and treated skiing more like something to post than something to enjoy. She built a small but steady following with quick edits and risky dares. Brands sent her gear, resorts shared her videos, and her longtime college friend Mara Holt, 26, was often beside her. Mara skied carefully, avoided attention, and asked more than once not to be filmed, but Lena ignored it. Fear turned into jokes, falls into captions, and the views kept growing. Mara worked in logistics and liked order, which Lena brushed off as boring, but Mara relied on to feel in control. Over time, the teasing stopped being casual. Lena tagged Mara without asking, focused on her fear, and turned mistakes into content. On this trip, Lena said she would stop. She didn't. That morning's goal was a sponsored post, a steep line that looked fearless. Conditions made it risky. Wind-loaded snow sat on refrozen crust, and patrol had flagged several side bowls as unsafe for aggressive skiing. Lena dismissed the warnings. She needed something dramatic. On the lift, Lena filmed Mara's reluctance and posted it live. The comments laughed. At the top, Mara said they should turn back. Lena skied a short distance into a side bowl and stopped at a rollover, calling for Mara to follow so she could film the descent. From above, the surface looked smooth. Lena dropped in first to set the angle. She made 2 controlled turns and stopped near a narrow section where coverage thinned. Mara followed slowly, stopping several feet uphill. Lena shouted for her to come closer, angling her camera back uphill. What happened next was brief and visible. Mara stepped forward and shoved Lena hard from behind, both hands to her upper back. The push knocked Lena off balance before she could reset her stance. Her skis crossed. She slid immediately, accelerating downslope. Lena tried to recover, but the surface alternated between ice and breakable crust. One ski edge caught and released. A pole snapped. Her body tumbled, striking exposed rock beneath the snow. Her helmet took multiple impacts. She slid until her body folded sharply against the slope and stopped. Mara stood still for several seconds. Then she skied down. Lena was alive when Mara reached her. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Blood pooled near her head. One leg was visibly twisted. Mara waved for help. Another skier stopped and contacted patrol. The first responder arrived within minutes. Lena lost consciousness during transfer to the sled. She was pronounced dead at the clinic. The coroner reported severe blunt force trauma, skull fracture, cervical spine injury, collapsed lung, and internal bleeding. Death occurred shortly after the fall. No substances were found. Investigators later reviewed fixed mountain cameras and multiple phone videos posted earlier that morning. The footage showed the shove clearly. The patrol warnings were visible in frame. Mara was charged with manslaughter and later accepted a plea deal, receiving a 12-year federal sentence with parole eligibility after 8. She deleted her accounts and returned all sponsor equipment. Lena's final video stayed online for several days before removal. The run reopened after the next snowfall erased the tracks.